Good morning, everyone. This is the 18th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, and I'd like to thank all witnesses and members for being here today, as well as our staff. This meeting will take place in a hybrid format
La motion adoptée.
in accordance with the motion passed in the House.
Participating in person and by Zoom as our witnesses. Just a few comments to start us off. Please wait until I recognize you and give you the floor before speaking. We had an incident last committee meeting, which was really interesting. I'm sure that won't happen again. You'll be recognized by name. We're also on the Zoom application for interpretation. You just go onto the globe icon on the bottom. You can choose floor, English or French, anglais ou français, ou floor. All comments should go through the chair, and then when you're recognized, then you'll be able to speak. And today, in conformity avec the motion, la motion adoptée,
Pursuant to the motion adopted in the House
of April 26, 2022, we're going to study the situation in Haiti. Aujourd'hui, nous avons
Today, in our first panel, on a point of order, Mr. Chairperson, we have an interpretation issue. The witness is having difficulty hearing the interpretation.
OK, parfait. Donc,
Perfect. So as I was saying, we have three witnesses here with us today. We have Mr. Chalmers Larose, a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the Université du Québec à Montréal.
From the Association of Human Capital of Ethno-Cultural Youth of Tomorrow, we have Monsieur Patrick Auguste en person. We also have from Little Footprints, Big Steps International Development Organization, Miss Morgan Weinberg by Zoom. Now we'll have opening remarks from everyone pendant 5 minutes.
5 minutes apiece.
Signal like this when you have 1 minute, so just please keep an eye on yours truly. And then I'll go like this when you have 30 seconds. Once you hit the 5 minutes, I will interrupt. You'll be able to continue what you want to say through questions and answers. Donc, on va commencer avec...
We'll start with Mr. Larose. The floor is yours, sir. Sorry, Mr. Rose is not with us yet. So we'll start with Mr. August in person. 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I begin? I'd like to start by thanking you for having me here today. I'll just provide a quick diagnosis of the state of affairs, give you my thoughts, and propose a number of solutions. Currently in Haiti, we see there's a political paralysis that has favoured the emergence of violence by armed groups, a weakening of institutions, the police, justice, and broad-based insecurity, economic paralysis, a deterioration of the socio-economic climate, a rapid deterioration of living conditions enjoyed by the majority of the population, a total loss of trust and confidence in the authorities fueled by a paralysis of the government machinery. How have we gotten to this point? Well, in my opinion, there's been an ongoing deterioration of the political dialogue since the fall of the Duvalier dictatorship in 1986. It was 36 years ago. There's been an increasingly conflictive political and social atmosphere, increasingly divisive, increasing social and political fractures, and a fragmented and divided society. Which groups are involved? Political activists. They are constantly fueling the political conflict by accusing each other, pointing fingers at each other as being the cause of all the country's problems. They're systematically blocking the development of any consensus because of their inflexible approach. It's an all-or-nothing approach and not a win-win approach. The authorities are playing the same game as the political activists. Informal and illegitimate armed groups are fueling this level of insecurity by way of violence perpetrated against the population, kidnappings, robberies, threats, also against police forces and institutions, courthouses recently, and against political activists. This is worsened by the entry of a large number of illegal arms and ammunition into the country and taking of ransom from police and victims of the collection of ransoms from kidnappers. The police forces are increasingly overwhelmed and unable to fight back against these informal and illegitimate armed groups. There is an increasing number of police officers being murdered as well. Now, there is an anti-intervention movement afoot, that is by the foreign global community. There's an internal... The country is strongly diasporic. And this is largely explained by the mistakes made in previous attempts by foreign countries. There's been an abuse of the vulnerable population, including women and children, pressure to increasing prices, housing and food, disease, cholera. There has been international political support for the foreign government, and the local population sees that the government seems to be powerless and acting in bad faith in its negotiations with its political opponents. There's no leadership, there's no published timetable for an election and a handover of power to elected authorities, and that was since the assassination of the last elected president, Jovenel Moïse, over a year ago now. But support internally for foreign intervention is suffering as a result of that. The Haitians are increasingly deprived of the essentials and exposed to increasing violence, and they have a sense of being abandoned. And I spoke with my brothers living there, and they've expressed a support for foreign intervention. And this is regrettable in the sense, but I guess it is preferable to being subjected to violence by armed gangs. One needs to bear in mind what has occurred in the past and avoid repeating the same mistakes, as I just mentioned. And there needs to be more negotiations. I'm going to stop there because I realise that I have run out of time, but I'd be more than happy to respond to your questions in due course. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. August.
Ms. Weinberg, for 5 minutes by Zoom, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My original intent was to draw the committee's attention to the violation of children's rights due to systemic family separation and the exploitation of children in Haiti in for-profit institutions. Yet due to the current crisis, even the most basic of human rights are now inaccessible to most Haitians. Due to what we can only call a civil war, there are currently over 100,000 internally displaced persons in Haiti. Many families remain homeless since the 2021 earthquake. Schools are not operating. Multiple times over the past 5 years, all students nationwide have been deprived of access to education. Hospitals and ambulances have become non-functional. Many medical procedures are only available in Port-au-Prince, which is currently inaccessible. Blood transfusions and oxygen are challenging to access, especially in regions outside of the capital. Malnutrition is rampant. Amidst exponential inflation, most families have lost their source of income due to prolonged lockdowns and lack of circulation within the country. Shortages of critical supplies have caused even more crippling inflation in regions that have been cut off from the capital. Families who were considered middle class a few months ago are now struggling to feed themselves. Prisoners are dying of famine. And the penal code is actually not respected in Haiti, as many children in prisons are below the minimum age, and prisoners can spend over a year in prison without even having a trial. Child prisoners are often placed in adult cells as punishment and are sexually as well as physically abused within the prisons. Haitian Social Services has identified a spike in separated and unaccompanied children due to the current crisis. Street children are being recruited and even trafficked by armed gangs and then forced to commit crimes. As families struggle to survive, children are at a higher risk of being placed in institutions. Already, over 700 orphanages in Haiti are currently operating illegally, in which countless children's rights violations are occurring, including severe neglect, physical and emotional abuse, child trafficking, and sexual exploitation. Foreign pedophiles often prey on children in orphanages and are difficult to reprimand despite formal reporting. Political connections and financial means allow several human rights offenders within Haiti to be seemingly untouchable. While Haitian authorities attempt to close illegal orphanages and reunite separated children with their families, orphanage directors often bribe, threaten, or dismiss local authorities due to an imbalance of resources. Foreign support for child protection or any other sector must be aligned with the initiatives and recommendations of Haitian experts in that domain. Otherwise, we may unintentionally be supporting the various systems that are exploiting children. Many girls and boys in Haiti are resorting to prostitution as a means of survival. Sexual violence is also rampant as high numbers of women and children are being raped. This is not isolated to the capital. Insecurity has spread across Haiti. Murders and sexual assault are often filmed and shared nationwide, yet seldom penalized. The toll this has taken on mental health is debilitating. These issues are the results of continually soaring poverty levels, a lack of economic stability, a weak justice system, and the abuse of power by corrupt politicians, as well as a small group of elite, influential families. Immediate action is required to address access to basic supplies, affordable transportation, medical care, and education, to reduce the unrealistic cost of living, to curb child trafficking, and to allow Haitian people to circulate safely in their own country. However, longer-term action is also required to address the systemic separation of and exploitation of children throughout institutions, to push for prioritization of child welfare, to ensure that international interventions provide sustainable support that actually builds the capacity of Haitian citizens and infrastructure to remain more autonomous in the future, and to hold Haiti's leadership accountable for the conditions and treatment of the Haitian people so that the current crisis is not repeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feinberg, and we'll continue with Mr. Larose, Monsieur Larose, 4 or 5 minutes. Vous êtes en...
You're on mute, sir. Can you hear me now? Yes, indeed. Distinguished members of the committee, in response to your invitation to appear, I'm pleased to appear before your committee today as part of your study on the current situation in Haiti. I am a Haitian by birth, a specialist in international relations, an observer of the Haitian and regional political situation, and it is therefore in this capacity that I'm honoured to share with you my observations and thoughts about what can be called the Haitian problem. Mr. Chairperson, may I begin by a historical, contextual overview of Haiti on the international checkerboard. As a former French colony in Santo Domingo, Haiti gained its independence by dismantling the slave and colonial structures that sustained the regime of the time. The contribution of the new state was exemplary, both in terms of the development and strengthening of ideals of freedom and equality in the world, and in particular at the regional level, in terms of its contribution to securing freedoms enjoyed by Latin Americans. However, following the country's independence, several generations of Haitians were forced to compensate their heirs of their former slave masters. The burden of Haiti's dual debt, that is, the compensation and the loans taken out to pay for the compensation was monumental, and this set Haiti on a path of stunted development, all the while lining the pockets and enriching major financial centres of Europe and North America. Today, the situation in Haiti is catastrophic. These are sombre times. Haitians are forced to flee Haiti and endure inhuman conditions in an effort to find work. More than poverty, this is financial destitution. Hospitals have no resources or equipment. Roads are blocked. There's no judiciary. There's violence, which is rife. The government has completely lost control of everything, and the state is in free fall, and Haitians are at their wits' end. On top of this, there's the damage caused by repeated natural disasters and an endemic political and social crisis. These are the grave ramifications. What's more, what tends to be described as criminal gangs that spread terror are in fact the direct result of a very singular political phenomenon. The transnationalized economic political elites, propped up by foreign governments on the pretext of the current geopolitical turmoil, exploit these impoverished sectors of civil society and use them as instruments to wage political warfare by providing them with arms and ammunition and offering them political and judicial protection. Mr. Chairperson, distinguished members of the committee, to address this situation, many stakeholders are in favour of a humanitarian intervention. I am not at all in favour of such an intervention. Events in the country over the past 20 years clearly indicate that the past is no indication of what the future holds. I recommend the proponents of an intervention reflect on the Organization of American States assessments on the subject, and I quote, "The last 20 years of international community's presence in Haiti constitute one of the most significant and obvious failures of the internationally led efforts to stabilize Haiti." And I'm referring to the last 20 years of misguided political strategy. Notwithstanding that, the international community has been unable to help build one single institution with the capacity to respond to the problems of Haitians. 20 years later, not a single institution is stronger than it was before. That's the OAS. I also quote Ambassador Daniel Foote, former US Special Envoy to Haiti, who in his resignation letter stated, "This cycle of international political intervention in Haiti has consistently produced catastrophic results. Further negative impacts on Haiti will have disastrous consequences not only in Haiti, but in the United States and our hemispheric neighbours." Given this situation, what can possibly be done to help Haiti get back on its feet? The first step is to restore a climate of safety and security, relative safety and security. In the immediate future, international cooperation in Haiti must focus on urgent security assistance. Haiti is a country with a unique and specific trajectory whose security cannot be left entirely to the whims of external forces or so-called friendly countries, nor can it be left exclusively in the hands of the police. While strengthening the Haitian police remains essential, it is also essential to focus on the military component of security by redeploying Haiti's armed forces. I'm sorry to cut you off, sir. The political compromise that emerges from this can facilitate the transition to elected power without... I'm sorry to cut you off, Mr. Larose. You have run out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off. We'll give you an opportunity to continue in the question and answer period. Now, let's start with a round of questions.
And please for 7 minutes.
Thank you. I thought Mr. Wilson wants to go first, but I can. Not sure if he communicated that to you. Okay. I will start with Mr. Larose. I think I would have loved for him to continue his testimony as he was bringing or going down to the real cause of the problem and also the solutions that can really be long-term solutions rather than Band-Aid as we as he probably indicate, in a way that's been the case for the last 20 years. The question is, if we to take a priority list of what needs to be done to start finding meaningful action to first stop what's going on in the country of violence, all the disasters that the country's been going through, plus now the unrest and the kidnapping and all kind of implications on some vulnerable communities there, especially children and women. If I would ask Mr. LaRose to give me a list of priorities, what needs to be done, sort of a roadmap, what will he say to us?
Yes. Well, I've not finished with my speech, but according to your question, I will say the following: the situation in Haiti is complex, but also simple. It has been a situation that has been going on for a while. The problem in Haiti is a lack of security. How now to handle the security question in Haiti is by providing resources to the security forces in Haiti. The international community, since 1994, created a police force in Haiti and destroyed the Haitian army. The premise behind this was that a police force was sufficient to provide security to the Haitian people. But now, and as time passes, we have realized that that is not the case, and that will never be the case given the nature of the Haitian society. So what can be done as far as security is concerned in Haiti? You have to, we can provide resources, logistic resources, and build the human resources necessary for the national police. And second, in parallel, we build the Haitian army as a security force of the second order. The combination of the two security forces should and would provide the security necessary for the Haitian force and prevent international intervention in Haiti.
So rebuilding the army is not as easy a task as we may think. It's going to take resources of all kinds. What do you think the reason and why the international community is not really intending to go that way? Can you tell us what do you think could be the reason why arming or rebuilding the army is not on the list of things that on the table right now?
Well, it would take me a long time to comment about this, but I think there was a reading of the situation in Haiti that goes to the history of the army in Haiti, because you have to take into account that this army that we had before 1994 was built by the Americans in 1914, when they invade Haiti. They built an army, and this army was the kind of forces that they have on the ground. This army was very much politicized in its content and also in its actions. This army also was responsible for the coup d'etat against the elected government in Haiti in 1991. So the reading was, if we eliminate the army, democracy will prevail. So in the context of the Haitian of the Haitian society, the army was a kind of obstacle for the emergence of democracy. So they removed the army. and they emphasized the police. But the police was never organized and was never sufficient to provide the security necessary in all areas of Haiti. So the problem was that for ideological reasons, for political reasons, and for geopolitical reasons also, and economic reasons regarding the island, the army of Haiti was destroyed, leaving Haiti in a situation of security vacuum.
Thank you for that. Right now, there's over 100,000 displaced Haitian in the country. There's health crisis with cholera and all other health conditions. There's the education system is broken or is not there. Those implications on most vulnerable children and women. And that seems to be the top priority for the international community to tackle and to work on before we, and on the other side, I agree that, you're talking about the security issue and trying to, strengthen the army or the police forces to play the role possible to bring back law and order. But if you were to describe, again, back to the priorities, do you have any idea what will take to at least deal with the health crisis and the educational crisis at the moment?
We'll have to allow that answer in the next subsequent rounds. We've reached 7 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Abdul Tayeb. We'll now continue on to the Liberal Party for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll split my time with Mr. Hanley. I'd like to direct my question to Ms. Weinberg. I know that you have recently returned from Haiti, that you, in fact, have been spending years working on children's rights, particularly on the exploitation of children in institutions. This is something that predated the current crisis, but could you tell us a little bit about what the impact of the current crisis is having on exacerbating the problems? And may I also take this moment to thank you for the incredible advocacy you're doing for the children of Haiti.
Thank you. Yes, for some context, I have actually lived in Haiti personally for over a decade and just come back to Canada at the end of September. Due to the situation in Haiti, I was forced to leave. Even before the current crisis, as I mentioned, actually since 2018, the Haitian government requested that no new orphanages be opened in the country because they recognized, thanks to extensive international research, the damage that such institutions do to have on children. And unfortunately, due to foreign donations and volunteers, there's this false demand created for the development of institutions. So we as Canadians do have a responsibility to play a role in curbing that. Due to the current crisis, children who are already being neglected and abused in orphanages are experiencing extremely dire conditions. We're receiving reports of children actually running away and leaving orphanages because they're not being fed. It's unclear as to if these children are returning to their families or simply showing up in the streets, although social services is receiving numerous children simply unaccompanied in the streets of all ages. There are also orphanages that are actually trafficking children, both in the form of displacing the children in the orphanages to safer locations due to the insecurity. However, they're doing this without informing Haitian authorities, without informing the children's parents, because the majority of children in orphanages have living parents. In addition to that, there's always a risk at times of disaster, times of unrest, of an influx of children actually being taken away from their families and going into orphanages or being abandoned into orphanages because the situation is so desperate and families are struggling.
Mr. Hanley, I'll share my time.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. Thank you for the opportunity for me to participate. And I'm also going to be very quick to allow Monsieur Dubourg also to ask a question, as I know time is limited. But Morgan, I'd like to pass back to you and again recognize the dedication over the last more than a decade that you have given to the plight of children in Haiti. And I want to maybe take a moment to look beyond stabilization of the current crisis and how we as a country can continue to focus on the children of Haiti, the violence, the exploitation, the trafficking that they have been subject to over many years, even decades, and will continue to be once we hopefully get to stabilization of the crisis. What's the best way that Canada can play a role? And if I could ask you to describe more or less in a minute so that Monsieur Dubourg has time for a question as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you, MP Hanley, for your question. It's really important that, again, we as Canadians or other foreign countries recognize our responsibility in addressing the child rights violations of children in Haiti and other countries similar, because we do play a role in perpetuating the cycle of exploitation that they're experiencing. Because of an imbalance of resources, which I mentioned, Haitian Child Protection Authorities, primarily social services, IBESR, and the Child Protection Brigade of the Police, BPM, they really struggle with actually enforcing laws and initiatives to address child trafficking, these abusive for-profit orphanages, and other child rights crises, because NGOs and mission foreign support is so much stronger than the resources that the government actually has. And as a result, there are situations where orphanage directors, child rapists, all different child rights offenders really just dismiss the government because they're able to continue receiving support that allows them to either bribe or threaten their victims, and at times bribe and threaten the government as well. So it's important that we ensure that our citizens are educated on this topic, that they're supporting families and communities as opposed to institutions, and that all organizations, all Canadian organizations, are working in alignment with the Haitian Child Protection Authorities.
In the last minute, Mr. Dubourg.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair. Merci aussi.
Thank you to the witnesses for participating in this committee meeting. I'd like to ask a question very quickly of Mr. Larose. Thank you for your remarks, sir. Mr. Larose, this is a human rights committee currently in Haiti. Reports are telling us that there are children of 10 years of age being raped in the presence of their parents. Thousands of pregnant women without services. Now, you're talking about bolstering the police forces. What can we do immediately, given the urgent situation in Haiti? Thank you, sir, for your question. Now, I understand that your committee focuses on human rights. Now, if you look at the Haitian problem from that perspective, well, you're going down the wrong track. It's misguided. Now, even though human rights in Haiti is of great import and a top priority, and there are human rights violations occurring in Haiti, they're rampant. So, you know, that's happening. Mr. Larose, I'm sorry to cut you off.
We've reached our time.
So here's what I could say. It's absolutely crucial that the international community continue to engage with Haiti to protect human rights and to assist those Haitians in difficulty.
Merci, on va continuer. Monsieur Alexis Brunel-Duceppe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here for this important study. I'd like to tack on to Mr. Dubourg's question, if I may. You said that we shouldn't be focusing on the current crisis from a human rights perspective because that would be going down the wrong track. And even though there are extreme human rights violations, you're advocating a different approach. You want me to respond? Yes, indeed. Please do, Mr. Larose. Well, what I'm saying is if you look at the Haitian problem from a human rights perspective, you'll be constantly engaging in damage control. It's as if you have a wound and a Band-Aid to cover that wound, but you don't address the root problem. In other words, it's superficial. Now, the Haitian problem is such that there is a huge need to address the security issues, and by addressing the security issues, the human rights issues can also be addressed. Now, there are a number of steps, a number of levels of this Haitian crisis. The top priority is to put out the fire, metaphorically speaking, in Haiti. And then we'll be able to address all the underpinning issues before getting to the root cause. That's the strategy I advocate for. First, put out the fire, metaphorically speaking. Second, address the underpinning issues. Food crisis, human rights violations crisis, energy crisis. That's part and parcel with addressing the security issues. And I believe that the security issues need to be addressed by Haitians themselves. In other words, security forces must get supplies and equipment from foreign powers so that they themselves can respond on the ground in the crisis, in the situation in Haiti. And we'll also be able to address security in Haiti by bolstering security forces and by remobilizing Haiti's armed forces, which under normal circumstances would be the security mechanism in Haiti and not foreign powers. Mr. Larose, well, listen, there are two conflicting proposals here. The Haitian government is calling for assistance. The United States is advocating a response force that would be spearheaded by the United Nations, and there are others that advocate for a Haitian solution, and that the only way to address the current Haitian problem is by Haitians in order to bolster the sovereignty of Haitians. Now, what do you favour? Do you favour international actors intervening or domestic stakeholders addressing the issue? Response. Well, there is a direct link between what's going on domestically in Haiti and what's happening abroad. And that's why I started my remarks by providing a context for the creation of the Haitian state, which led to huge ramifications, a push and pull between what happened domestically and what happened abroad. Haiti was banished by the rest of the world for over a century, in a sense. It was a leper, a pariah. And now the Americans came to Haiti. They've created an army, but that army was there for Americans and for America primarily, and not so much for Haitians. So if you look at the chronology of the events, the fall of the Duvalier dictatorship, the arrival of the Americans, and then the President Aristide, this is a vicious circle, and which culminated in the UN intervention. Now, what I mean to say by all of that is, as a researcher in the field of international relations, is this. It's irrational to try to fix Haitians' problems by allowing international stakeholders to address the problem. We have to empower Haitians. Why? How do we do this? Well, I'd like to know why the international community always believes that when they intervene in Haiti, it's just to address a security issue. Why don't they address it permanently if they come temporarily to Haiti? Well, what role can Canada play then? Is it better to not intervene? Or is there a way of intervening without damaging Haitian sovereignty? Well, thank you, sir, for your question. Since you're asking about Canada's foreign policy, I believe that Canada should develop a foreign policy about Haiti that would be measured and respectful. Canada should also have its own voice in this crisis and not just be the lapdog of the United States in this crisis. Canada's approach needs to reflect Canada's values, Canada's vision of human rights, of security, and the world at large, and not kowtow to the United States in an effort to address the Haitian problem. I firmly believe that Canada cannot, in today's context, develop a capricious foreign policy. In other words, Canada should not try to develop a foreign policy that is not in line with Canada's values and traditions. Canada cannot spearhead an intervention in Haiti. That would be counterproductive and fly in the face of Canada's traditions and values. In my humble opinion, Canada should continue to foster normalized relations with the Haitian society by way of its usual instruments and mechanisms, i.e. the conventional mechanisms that Canada has at its disposal, the advocacy organizations, the human rights and development organizations, by supporting the Haitian police. Now, at the same time, if Canada deems it necessary, Canada could consider mobilizing Haiti's armed forces. Now,
questioner, Monsieur Boulouris.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being here for this important study today. Quebec has a favoured relationship with Haiti and has had one for a number of years. There are a number of Quebecers and Canadians that are of Haitian origin. There are a lot of Haitian institutions in Montreal, in Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, my riding. There's the Bureau of Haitian Coalition in my riding. There are other associations that are... and so there has been a friendship developed with Haiti over the years, such that this terrible situation is even more painful to bear witness to. And it really hurts as a Montrealer and as a Quebecer to witness what is occurring in Haiti. This is a failed state by all appearances. A lot has been said, but I'd like to focus on security and a transitional government with a view to holding legitimate elections. But first and foremost, Haitians need to be safe. That must be the top priority. Haitians are being attacked, killed, threatened, kidnapped, raped. There's corruption is rife. There are street gangs. And in the New Democratic Party, we believe that there needs to be a stabilization of Haiti that is led by Haitians for Haitians. Now, what role can Canada, however, play, concretely speaking, to assist in this stabilization and to provide greater security and safety for Haitians without necessarily interfering? And I'd like to hear from all of the witnesses, and we could perhaps start with Mr. August. Well, first, we need to restore trust. What I would propose is that Canada do a mea culpa on behalf of the international community. about all the misguided interventions in the past, and that this be made in the public sphere. And this must be in tandem with transparency. There needs to be a team effort, a joint task force struck with foreign stakeholders. Canada could play a leadership role with Haitian local leaders, not just government authorities, and the civil population could take part in this committee, as well as the Haitian diaspora. There could be about 12 people around the table that would play a leadership role vis-à-vis this intervention. Now, as far as the mistakes made in the past, all stakeholders must make their mea culpa and go to great lengths to improve the current state of affairs. Now, when it comes to security, there's a whole political sphere to these gangs. If we restore trust and faith and confidence, I think that that will help to quell these gangs. We need to strengthen institutions. We need to strengthen the police, the judiciary, and gradually the population will start to breathe again. And so what will be the upshot of that? I think that in 3 to 5 years, we can get Haiti back on its feet, but each and every stakeholder needs to do a mea culpa. What's happening now is everyone passes the buck. The foreigners are responsible, the Haitians are responsible, the gangs are responsible, Aristide's gang group are responsible. But, it doesn't help anyone if you pass the buck. We have a diaspora here. Not one single stakeholder can address the Haitian problem, especially not the Haitian authorities. Ms. Weinberg, on the issue of security, what role can Canada play to support the stabilization of Haiti for the benefit of Haitians?
Thank you for the question. I think that security has been raised. We do need to, in my opinion, address the human rights issues, which are critical, at the same time as we address security and consider the long-term impacts of our interventions. We're talking about over 100,000 internally displaced people. These are not people living in shelters. These are people completely exposed in public locations, people dying of famine, all of the human rights violations we talked about. These need to be addressed immediately. This is why people on the ground who would not favor an international intervention are asking for it. It's because they're so desperate for some relief. However, as we address these immediate needs, we need to keep in mind the long-term impacts, which is something that has been a mistake in the past with international interventions. The Haitian government cannot be the voice that foreign governments are listening to, because it's very clear that the Haitian government is not acting on the interests of the Haitian people. I love the previous witness's idea of involving community leaders, not just Haitian authorities, but civil society as well, who are already active and helping their communities in times like this with the very minimal means that they have. We also have to make sure that we're building the capacity, and I think Monsieur Larose also mentioned, addressing the security issue, just removing the gangs is not resolving the root cause of the issue. There are influential families and also politicians puppeteering these gangs, paying citizens to go and protest and cause chaos and roadblocks in their communities. If we don't have sanctions against those individuals, we will see this same situation repeated again and again after the humanitarian crisis is seemingly resolved. So we do have to look at that. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Weinberg.
Thank you, Ms. Weinberg. You have 30 seconds left, sir. Well, there are some excellent suggestions that have been made by Ms. Weinberg and Mr. Auguste that will help us with our study and in a constructive way. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you very much, Mr. Boulerice, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Now, we're going to suspend just for a couple of seconds before introducing the next panel. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the witnesses for being here today. You'll have an opportunity to submit an additional 10-page document
on our website if you want to do that. However, everything you've said has been included in evidence and will be used for our work. So we'll suspend for a moment and continue. We'll suspend just for a minute, not longer, and continue to our second panel. Feel free to get a glass of water. session. And merci à les témoins d'être ici.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. As an individual, we have Philippe Dieudonné appearing in person, who's a Master of Project Management, and from the Haitian Coalition in Canada against the dictatorship in Haiti, we have Chantal Ismé, who's a feminist activist and community researcher.
So we'll start off. On va commencer avec.
We'll start with Mr. Dieudonné for 5 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, good morning. I won't talk about a number of issues that have already been raised. I'd like to talk about the impact of security on the everyday lives of Haitians. Security is the result of poor governance over many years and a lack of investment at a social level. Now, when people are left to their own devices, children are left to their own devices in the streets, that has an impact on security and produces delinquents and criminals, thefts, murderers, kidnappers, terror reigns. And that underpins the entire society and filters through to the political leaders and even the business people. Unfortunately, these fragilized children are being exploited to help to reign terror and maintain chaos in the country. And people are defending their own interests. Now, what about an international intervention? Some are against, some are for. Those who are against foreign intervention make a number of arguments. French colonization, US invasions, and a whole host of factors. And sometimes these positions are justified. But one wonders what has been done to prevent all the evils that are occurring in Haiti. You are well of the widespread killings in Haiti. There is a dearth of responsible leadership. The Haitian people are left to their own devices. Nobody is looking after them. Nobody is taking charge of them. There's no dialysis machines in hospitals. There's no safety and security. One can't even get drinking water, which is something that's essential to all human beings. The country has been laid to waste. So here's what I can propose. I think that we've heard a lot here today, and concrete proposals are what counts the most. If there were to be an intervention, then there needs to be structured transition. There needs to be competent leadership with integrity and a fully fledged participation in something akin to a Marshall Plan. Why not? We have resources in Haiti. Let's set up a win-win situation so that Haiti can enjoy some level of development. There needs to be a win-win situation. And if there were to be an international intervention and Canada would take part in it, Canada needs to ensure the following. First, there needs to be military intervention led by the domestic authorities, stakeholders of the diaspora who are guided by integrity and not their own personal interests. There needs to be enough military to address the security issues in the short term. There shouldn't be any. We need to combat fake news, of course, as well. And these military interventionists need to be paid adequately. And if they're not, they might end up re-weaponizing the gangs as they have in the past. And that's not what we want to see in Haiti. We want something meaningful to occur. because we don't want to further empower the gangs. There needs to be an international obligation that is results-focused and is in line with the values of liberty and freedom and human rights. There needs to be drones and other weapons to target these criminals. We've just seen what's occurred with the Iranian generals that were identified, pinpointed exactly where they were. So why not in the case of the gangs in Haiti? They can be targeted by drone strikes. Their very lifeblood can be cut off. Civil society, business people, politicians can play a role in blocking their bank accounts and stopping. And there needs to be ammunition brought to Haiti. Oftentimes that comes from the United States. But let's work upstream with the United States.
On va continuer avec notre
Thank you, sir. We'll continue with our next witness. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Ismay.
I'm going to give you a hand signal for 1 and 30 seconds. Madame Ismay, vous êtes en sourdine.
You're on mute. I'm the second witness. I didn't realize I was the second witness, but in any event. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity to speak about the situation in my country of origin, and especially to give voice to the demands and hopes of the Haitian people. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to bring you a strong message from the Haitian people, both in Haiti and in the diaspora, of their categorical rejection of any intervention on their territory. We are formally opposed to any form of intervention, regardless of what one chooses to call it: occupation, intervention, stabilization, peacekeeping, how it would be conducted, and those who would purport to conduct it. The Haitian people have historically experienced the disastrous consequences of multiple interventions since the European invasion of our land in 1492. For example, the genocide of the Taino people, which led to the arrival of slaves from Africa, the cost of independence imposed on Haiti by France in 1825, the American occupation from 1915 to 1934, and the theft of the gold reserve held by the National Bank, a gold reserve that was never returned to its rightful owners, the dispossession of the peasantry, as well as an orchestrated forced migration, the dismantling of state institutions, the replacement of the national army by a stateless gendarmerie. These invasions have always taken place on the pretext that the invader was seeking to help Haiti, to civilize Haiti, or to restore peace. Today, the core group, under the leadership of Canada, among others, wishes to respond to what amounts to an unconstitutional, illegal request from an illegitimate government, decried by the Haitian people, to address insecurity and resolve the humanitarian crisis in Haiti. It goes without saying that Haiti is currently facing one of the worst crises affecting all spheres of society. But this crisis is not new, and it is a consequence of policies foisted on the Haitian people by local stooges in both the political and business sectors. This has led to a dismantling of the Haitian economy. For over 20 years, the Canadian Armed Forces and police forces like the RCMP have been part of the Casque Bleu and the different UN missions in Haiti. There have been a number of them. The last stabilization force in the country was there until 2022 and had the mandate to, quote, support good governance, stability, professionalization of the police, reducing community violence and gang violence. None of this achieved its stated objectives. Instead, it brought suffering to a population with an increase in the number of rapes, prostitution, and the perpetrators of these crimes are not held to account. The core group countries are not factoring in the demands and requests of the Haitian people. Nothing has been said about the massacres, the kidnappings, only the elite is benefiting. This is leading to despair among families. For example, nothing's been said about the need to have a democratic society that respects human rights and the massive influx of weapons from the United States. Now, the Haitian people is calling on the Canadian government to avoid at all costs a genocide of the Haitian people, to stop supporting and propping up an illegitimate government, to support a Haitian solution to the crisis, and to be part of a consensual, concerted effort to respect the dignity of the Haitian people, the sovereignty of the Haitian people, and focus on the real needs of local stakeholders. Help to support the local police, help to bolster human rights, support the judicial system, to hold those perpetrators of human rights violations to account, to address the issue of all those who've died from cholera. Ladies and gentlemen, the Haitian people need help. Thank you very much, ma'am. I'm sorry to cut you off. You have run out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Having bells ringing,
Yeah.
I ask everyone's indulgence to continue on for 15 minutes sharp, and we'll enter questions, answers. Is that good with everybody? Yes? So we're going to have a fast round. Unanimous consent we have from everyone here. We'll continue on for 15 minutes sharp. That gives everybody just under 4 minutes. We're going to start off with the Conservative Party. Mr. Versen, for 4 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Chantal, I'm not exactly clear on what your specific ask is. If we're you don't want intervention and yet we want to bring stability to the region, I guess how do we do that? And is Canada uniquely qualified in some way around this? Chantal.
Merci.
Well, thank you very much for the question. If I've understood your question, and I was just listening to the interpretation, but if I've understood your question, you'd like to know what I'm concretely proposing, what role Canada can play. Well, first, what I suggest is that the competencies of Haitians be respected. We often talk about Haiti as a failed state, but what's lacking is resources, not human capital, equipment, logistical capacity. And therefore, we are asking that Canada, among other countries, but since I'm here speaking to Canadian parliamentarians, but I include in that effort other international stakeholders. For example, we need a bolstering of the national police sources, perhaps training for our police forces, as well as adequate equipment and resources, training about human rights, because we forget that these police forces are in fact flouting human rights in Haiti as well. So there needs to be training. But in the short term, well, there's been a diagnosis of Haiti carried out by international human rights organizations and other advocacy groups. So what I'm calling for is a collaborative effort on the part of foreign states that respects our dignity and takes into account the real needs of the Haitian people. So first and foremost, you need to sit down with the Haitian people and figure out how to intervene.
Mr. Versen.
Philippe, is there foreign interests that are driving some of the instability in Haiti?
Oui, certainement.
Yes, indeed. And that is what we're calling for here. For example, it's been possible to go to Vareux, where there are the fuel reserves, and the police forces were able to go there and free that fuel station. Now, why didn't that occur earlier? Well, unfortunately, a lot of factories are being closed down, and these problems have come to a head. So what the Haitian people are living, well, they've been living this for so many years. So what we're trying to say here is that we have to respect the needs and dignity of Haitian people and stop putting international interests first. And that of oligarchs, among other people.
Okay, but is there outside? So I get that. Is there outside forces though that are coming in and driving the instability in Haiti?
And just a sentence or two.
It's maybe yes or no.
Bon, on sait que par...
We know that in the past, governments had called on foreign forces and kidnapped demonstrators and, in fact, fostered an uprising. But I'm not a specialist in those areas, so I couldn't say more than that.
Thank you, Mr. Versen. Et Madame Esmy, on va continuer avec Monsieur Debourg. 4 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And I'd like to welcome the witnesses and thank them for their testimony today. It's very important to the study that we're undertaking. Ms. Ismay, I'd like to ask you the same question that I asked earlier in the previous panel. Now, there are thousands of women pregnant in Haiti who are getting no services. There are children under the age of 10 who are being raped in the presence of their parents. Now, you have alluded to Haitians' competence and skills. Canada has invested in this. Canada has provided training. Now, in terms of the solutions you're proposing, what can we do as of tomorrow when it comes to Haitians' human rights? Response. Thank you very much, Mr. Dubourg, for your question. First and foremost, as we said earlier, the first thing is to stop propping up the current government because it lacks the political will to address this issue, and that is the root problem. The leader of the government does not have the Haitian people's interests at heart. So, first and foremost, we need to get rid of this government that's being propped up and was put in place by foreign interests. Now, secondly, there are specialists, experts in the Haitian issue that don't have the equipment and the resources they need. We need more training for the National Police, more support, more equipment. This will help us to respond quickly to the problems being experienced by Haitians, but this needs to be spearheaded by the Haitian people. Well, thank you very much. I know that we don't have much time, so that's why I'm trying to move things along quickly. I hear you loud and clear. Now, I know that there is an issue with political leadership in Haiti. You referred to the Montana Accord, and it's my understanding that under the Montana Accord, things are completely falling apart and people are pointing fingers at each other. And I know that you're very involved in welcoming immigrants to Haiti, or to Canada, rather. But what message would you give to Haitians, to the youth of Haiti, in order to give them hope? Well, Mr. Chair, Sir, basically, the Haitian issue is not just a military issue. And we are against a foreign intervention. You cannot address a humanitarian crisis through an occupation. Most of the youth who are joining these gangs are desperate, and they're being weaponized by oligarchs and by these gang leaders. So we have to focus on that aspect of the crisis too. And that requires a collaborative effort. I don't have enough time to go into this, but we could perhaps buy the foodstuffs, buy those foodstuffs that are about to go bad and give them to the Haitian people before they do go bad. So we need to take a creative approach, but one that respects the will and desire of the Haitian people, that focuses on local needs. Well, thank you very much. Just a yes or no question, if I may. What about sanctions that should be imposed on the corrupt people in Haiti? Yes, there should be sanctions, but it should be under the aegis of a new Haitian government.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to the witness. This is highly interesting, and one realises how complicated the situation is. There are visions that are very opposed, even in Haiti and in the diaspora. Now, sir, earlier you said, I was confused. I don't know if you're in favour of an international intervention or not. Could you please elaborate on that? Well, I'm not directly in favour of an intervention per se. What I'm saying is, were there to be an intervention, it must be the decision reached by a committee comprised of people from civil society in Haiti, from the diaspora, real experts on the Haitian problem. It must be a decision that is reached by them. And it needs to be a win-win situation with a view to addressing the weapons issue in Haiti. There is a problem, a social problem, but what is the root cause of this societal issue, and why is it worsening? It's because there are too many armed gangs that have ammunition. Where does that ammunition come from? It comes from foreign countries. So we need to cut the source of those weapons and ammunition off at the source. And so Haitian experts, international experts, stakeholders such as Canada need to work together in the context of a potential intervention to address the root causes of this scourge. And perhaps in 3, 4, 5 years, as the issues are resolved, then there'll be fewer and fewer youth joining these gangs. And at the same time, there needs to be greater development in Haiti. Now, the United Nations, for example, was effective in some of its interventions in the Ivory Coast, for example. And so, therefore, there needs to be a collaborative approach. But if I may, I'm sorry, sir, I don't have much time, but I'll hand the floor over now to Ms. Ismay. I was very glad to hear what you had to say, Ms. Ismay. Do you feel that the Canadian government is currently supporting the Haitian government, a government that international stakeholders are condemning? Yes, I do. And that is what the Haitian population decries and is criticising the Canadian government for this unconditional support, along with the other members of the core group, of this illegitimate government that is overseeing the suffering of its people and is not taking action. And that is why the crisis is getting worse and worse. So you're saying that one of the first things that Canada should do is cut off all support to the current Haitian government. Absolutely. And that's just not my opinion. Most Haitians in the streets are calling for that. Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses. Sorry, I just had 4 minutes, so... Well, I don't even think that there is a government in Haiti right now, says Mr. Dieudonné.
Monsieur Boulris, pour 4 minutes.
Mr. Boulris, 4 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Ismay, I'm delighted to have someone from your coalition testifying in the context of this important study of the Human Rights Subcommittee. So I'd like to continue in the same vein, that is that the Canadian government should stop supporting the current Haitian government that you call illegitimate. We've heard a number of proposals to foster an international dialogue so civil society participates in. What else can the Canadian government do in order to support a transition and provide for legitimate elections and the election of legitimate leaders? Response. Well, the crisis is worsening in Haiti, and it's impossible to even speak of an election at this stage of the game, and that is the subject of consensus currently in Haiti. But that must remain the purview of Haitians themselves. Those are domestic issues and only concern Haitians. Canada's role would be limited to supporting Haitian-based proposals, and one need only think of the Montana Accord, which is the subject of consensus among civil society stakeholders, the working class, political organizations on both the left and the right. That would be a good starting point. These are men and women for the past 2 years who have been courageous and who are making a proposal, and that is to break away from the current government that is embroiled in corruption and acting with impunity. We need to empower the Haitians and give them the time to successfully engage in this transition and helps the Haitian society get ready for a democratic transition so that we can, at some point, have truly democratic elections that address the needs of the Haitian people. When you have an election, it's to elect representatives who are there to act in the best interests of the local people. So that's what needs to happen first. And that will give us a little bit of time to address the urgent issues and to help the Haitian people get reconciled with themselves, because that is also an issue. This is a people that has lived with over 100 years of injustice and social inequality. Well, thank you very much for your perspective. That gives us a keen sense of what needs to be done to have a successful transition. 1 minute left. Now, in the short term, I understand what you're suggesting in the mid-term and the long term, Ms. Ismay, but what about in terms of food security, the healthcare system? How can we address that in the short term? Because this situation can't drag on for months and years. You're absolutely right. And that is precisely why, in the recommendations that I've just made, that there needs to be support from the international community that focuses on real needs. Now, what does that mean? Yes, you can support the production of foods locally, for example. These are things that can be achieved in a very short time frame. But when it comes to security, as I've already said, we need to mobilize the strengths that already exist in Haiti and support them with training, equipment, and so on and so forth. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today.
Concludes our first day on Haiti. I want to draw to everybody's attention that there was an agreement between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front when considering the previous two sessions we've had. We are now going to adjourn this meeting, and we have votes within 14 minutes in the House. Again, thank you. Merci beaucoup à tous les témoins.
Thanks again to all the witnesses for being here today.